The most powerful man in the world wanted to disappear. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, commanded legions and shaped history, yet his private writings reveal a soul weighed down by a deep and persistent melancholy. This is the central paradox of his life, and it holds a startling secret about strength. By the end of this exploration, you will have a complete framework for transforming personal struggle into a source of resilience, drawn directly from his 2,000-year-old playbook. We are granted a unique window into this inner conflict through a text never meant for publication, his personal journal known as the Meditations. Within its pages, a ruler who could have anything grapples with weariness, disgust, and the temptation to retreat entirely. Private battle with depression not cripple his leadership, but instead become the very foundation of it. What can we learn from a man who ruled an empire while fighting to rule his own mind? The answer challenges everything we assume about power and vulnerability. When you feel the weight of your own responsibilities, where do you find the steady ground to stand? He inherited not just a throne, but a perfect storm. Marcus Aurelius became emperor in the year 161, a time when Rome's borders stretched farther than ever before. Maps showed a vast and seemingly unshakable empire, the pinnacle of ancient power. Yet that very scale was its greatest vulnerability. The frontiers along the Danube and in the east were under relentless pressure, demanding constant military vigilance. Almost immediately, a returning army brought with it a devastating illness that swept through the population, a health crisis that would recur for years and reshape society. Within his own court, the politics of maintaining power among ambitious senators and military commanders was a daily, delicate dance. The public saw a figure of calm authority, the philosopher king portrayed on coins and statues, a steady hand guiding the ship of state. But the private reality, as historians note from letters and accounts of the time, was a man bearing a crushing, unrelenting weight. The imperial office was less a privilege and more a ceaseless demand, a burden that never lifted. Every decision, from troop movements to grain supplies, carried the fate of millions. This was the backdrop against which his personal journal was written, not in a quiet library, but in military tents and palace rooms humming with anxiety. The serene face presented to the world was a necessary mask beneath which the real work of endurance was done. His own words strip away the marble facade. Within the pages of his private journal, a text we now call the Meditations, the emperor speaks with a raw honesty he showed to no one else. He writes of a deep weariness, a soul tired of its own vessel. In one passage, he reflects on the physical self with a palpable sense of detachment, noting the inevitable decline and the burdens of the flesh. He describes a feeling of nausea towards the repetitive cycles of pleasure and pain, a disgust with the mechanical needs of the body that must constantly be fed and rested. This is not a passing mood, but a recurring theme, a lens through which he frequently views human existence. At times, the weight seems almost unbearable. He writes of the temptation to simply withdraw, to retreat into a quiet corner and let the world's noise fade away. The impulse to escape the relentless demands of his position, to find a hiding place from duty itself, whispers through his lines. It is crucial to understand that we are not applying a modern clinical label to an ancient figure, but rather listening to his own testimony. He documents a persistent state of melancholy, a profound world weariness, and an emotional exhaustion that anyone who has faced a long internal struggle might recognize. He speaks of mornings where rising to meet the day feels like a monumental effort, and of the dense fog that can settle between a person and their purpose. This is the core of the mystery, These writings were not crafted for an audience, they were tools for survival, scratched onto parchment by candlelight during military campaigns. The very act of writing them was a lifeline, a method of sorting through the storm inside his mind. How does a person, especially one carrying the fate of an empire, function under such a constant internal weight? The answer lies not in the absence of the struggle, but in the specific way he chose to engage with it. He began to use the journal not just to vent, but to build. The journal was not a cry for help, but a workshop. Within its pages, Marcus Aurelius was not passively enduring his melancholy. He was actively using it as raw material. This is where the common misunderstanding of Stoicism shatters. He was not trying to cure his depression or suppress the feeling itself, which would have been like trying to command the sea to be still. Instead, he was applying a philosophical framework, a set of mental tools, to manage his relationship to those feelings. Think of it this way: a carpenter does not lament the hardness of the wood, he selects the right tool to shape it. For Marcus, Stoicism was that toolbox, and his own low moods were the wood. The core principle he worked with is that our suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our judgments about those events. An impression, what the Stoics called a fantasia, hits us, a feeling of weariness, a wave of disgust. The untrained mind immediately judges it as bad, as a catastrophe, as a sign of personal failure. This judgment is what amplifies the pain, creating a second layer of suffering on top of the initial feeling. Marcus' practice was to insert a pause between the impression and his judgment. He would examine the feeling not as a truth about the world, but as a piece of data about his own current state. This is not emotional suppression, it is emotional clarification. He writes to himself, "You have the power to strip away many unnecessary troubles that are wholly in your imagination." He is not denying the feeling exists, he is denying it the authority to define his entire reality. His depression, therefore, became the very material his philosophy worked upon. The heaviness in his chest was not an enemy to be defeated in battle, but a condition to be understood and navigated, like a sailor reading a stormy sky. This reframing is everything. It transforms a personal vulnerability from a source of shame into a field for practice. The goal was not a life of blank, emotionless serenity. The goal was a life of inner freedom, where external circumstances and internal weather could not capsize his core purpose, and that purpose for him was duty. Duty was the anchor he tied himself to when the internal storms grew fierce. This brings us to the first and most crucial discipline he practiced, the discipline of perception. For Marcus, perception was not a passive reception of the world, it was an active skill to be trained. He worked tirelessly to control his initial, automatic judgments about the events crashing against his life. A betrayal by a trusted advisor, a devastating report from the frontier, a personal loss, these were not, in his Stoic view, inherently good or bad things. They were simply facts, neutral in themselves. What made them destructive or constructive was the label he chose to slap onto them the moment they arrived. He trained himself to see every external event, no matter how chaotic or painful, as merely material for virtue. Think of a potter at a wheel. One potter might receive a lump of clay that is too wet, another a lump that is too dry. A poor potter would curse the material as bad and give up. A master potter sees the same clay not as a problem, but as the specific material they have been given to work with. Their skill is expressed in how they adapt their technique to that unique condition. To Marcus, the invasion of a Germanic tribe was not a catastrophe. It was damp clay. The plague sweeping through cities was not a divine punishment. It was gritty, difficult clay. His own melancholy was not a personal failing. It was a dense, heavy clay. The question was never, is this event good or bad? The question was always, what can virtue do with this? His journal is filled with these deliberate reframes. When faced with frustrating or lazy people, which for an emperor was a constant reality, he did not write long tirades about their flaws. Instead, he reminded himself, they are acting according to their own nature and ignorance, and my job is to meet them with justice and patience. That frustration became material for practicing patience. When exhausted on campaign, sleeping on a hard cot in a cold tent, he did not dwell on his discomfort. He reframed it as an opportunity to practice endurance and simplicity, to connect with the common soldiers sharing that hardship. The cold ground became material for practicing courage. Even the prospect of his own death, a shadow that hung over him constantly, was stripped of its terrifying judgment. He saw it not as a tragic end, but as a natural process, a transformation that every part of the universe undergoes. By refusing to see death as an evil, he removed its power to poison his present moments. This discipline did not make the events less real or less difficult. The plague still killed, betrayal still hurt, the work was still exhausting. What it changed was the second arrow. The Stoics had a famous saying, the first arrow is the event itself. The second arrow is our reaction to it, our panic, our outrage, our despair. The discipline of perception was the practice of catching that second arrow before it could ever be fired. He was building an inner citadel, not of stone, but of perception, where the chaos of the world could rage outside the walls without determining the peace within. And the blueprint for that citadel's walls came from a profound understanding of what was truly his to control. But seeing the world clearly was only the first step. The second discipline, the one that truly forged his legacy, was the discipline of action. This is where philosophy met the muddy ground of reality. Marcus Aurelius had a guiding principle, a simple yet profound rule he repeated to himself. What is not good for the hive is not good for the bee. His personal well-being, his moods, his desire for solitude were utterly secondary to the health of the collective body he served, the Roman Empire. His duty was not a choice, it was his nature as the leader of the hive, and so he acted even and especially when every fiber of his being wanted to retreat. The historical record shows us a ruler immersed in the granular details of governance. He would force himself to sit through long hours of legal hearings, listening to property disputes and appeals for mercy, dispensing justice with a patience that astonished his contemporaries. He personally reviewed military dispatches, planned supply lines for legions on distant frontiers, and negotiated with foreign emissaries, all while carrying that internal weight. He did not wait to feel motivated or inspired. He understood that action itself was the antidote to the paralysis of despair. In his journal, he commands himself to get out of bed and do the work of a human being. He frames inaction not as rest but as a violation of his purpose. Imagine a soldier on watch feeling a deep fatigue. The feeling is real, but the soldier knows that if he surrenders to it and falls asleep, the entire camp is vulnerable. His duty is to stay awake, to act according to his role, regardless of his internal state. Marcus viewed his imperial role with the same stark clarity. The melancholy was the fatigue, the empire was the camp he was sworn to guard. To withdraw into his own suffering would have been a profound betrayal of his fundamental reason for being. So he moved, he attended to the small, the mundane, the exhausting tasks of administration. In doing so, he discovered a powerful secret. Purposeful action has a momentum of its own. By focusing on the next right thing, the single letter to be written, the one petition to be heard, he could bypass the overwhelming enormity of his situation and his sadness. The action, however small, became a point of light in the fog, a proof that he was still capable, still useful, still part of the hive. This is not about brute force or ignoring pain. It is about channeling that very pain into a directed effort. His low energy was not an excuse for inaction. It was the condition under which action had to be taken. By committing to the work itself, he often found that the despair, which thrived on stillness and introspection, would loosen its grip, if only for the duration of the task. He was not running from his feelings, he was building a life of value alongside them. The court, the soldiers, the citizens, they did not see a man wrestling with darkness. They saw a steadfast emperor doing his duty, and in that consistent, reliable action they found their own stability. But how did he sustain this relentless output without burning out? The answer lies in a third, often overlooked discipline, one that protected him from the very temptations his power offered. The third discipline was his shield against despair, the discipline of will. While perception shaped his view of events and action directed his response, will governed his acceptance of the final outcome. This is the famous Stoic dichotomy of control, a simple idea with life-altering power. It states that some things are within our power and some things are not. Within our power are our own judgments, our impulses, our desires, and our actions. Not within our power are our body, our reputation, our wealth, and the actions of others. The serenity Marcus sought came from pouring all his energy into the first category and letting go of any desperate attachment to the second. In the chaos of battle, he could not control whether an enemy arrow would find its mark. He could control the thoroughness of his preparations, the discipline of his troops, and his own courage in the moment. In governance, he could not control whether a harvest would fail or a plague would spread. He could control the fairness of the laws, the efficiency of the grain supply system, and his own diligence in seeking solutions. The anxiety that cripples so many leaders, the fear of a bad result, was systematically disarmed by this practice. He trained his will to invest wholly in the effort and to accept the result, whatever it might be, with equanimity. This was not indifference or passivity. It was the ultimate form of focus. By releasing his grip on the uncontrollable, he freed up immense mental energy to excel at what he could actually influence. Imagine a farmer planting seeds. He can control the quality of the seed, the depth of the planting, the timing, and the watering. He cannot control a sudden drought or a hailstorm. A farmer who spends his days in a panic about the weather will neglect the tending of his field. A farmer who focuses entirely on perfecting his craft, while accepting that the skies are beyond his command, achieves peace and maximizes his chances of success. Marcus was that farmer, but his field was an empire. This discipline was brutally tested by the uncontrollable tragedies of his reign. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, swept through the population in waves, claiming countless lives, including, historians believe, that of his co-emperor and brother. Military campaigns saw brilliant victories but also staggering, unexpected losses. To see these events as personal failures, as signs he had not done enough, would have been a natural but devastating conclusion. His practice of will redirected that conclusion. He asked himself only, did I do everything within my power with virtue and wisdom? If the answer was yes, then the outcome, however tragic, was not a reflection of his worth or a reason to collapse. The plague was not in his control. The bravery of an enemy soldier was not in his control. His own commitment to seeking medical aid for citizens or to honoring the fallen with dignity, that was entirely within his control. This is how he managed the relentless randomness of his world. He anchored his sense of self not in the chaotic results of a single day, but in the integrity of his continuous effort. The weight of the world was heavy enough without also carrying the impossible burden of commanding every outcome, so he put it down. He carried only his own duty. This trio of disciplines, perception, action, and will, formed an interlocking system. Perception helped him see the clay without judgment. Action was his hands shaping that clay with virtue. Will was the acceptance that the final form of the pot, once fired in the kiln of fate, was never his to dictate. Together, they built the inner citadel. But a fortress is only as strong as its daily maintenance. How did he keep these walls from crumbling under the relentless siege of reality? The answer lies in a set of personal rituals, small, repeated practices that turned philosophy from a theory into a lived, breath-by-breath reality. His philosophy was not a lecture he attended, it was a drill he performed at dawn. Before the first official meeting, before the petitioners lined the halls, Marcus Aurelius would retreat into a moment of quiet preparation. We can reconstruct this ritual from the very structure of his journal, the Meditations, which reads less like a finished book and more like a series of personal briefings. This was his mental armor forged in the quiet hours each morning. He did not simply hope for a good day, he engineered his mindset to withstand whatever the day threw at him. The practice had 3 deliberate parts, a sequence that functioned as ancient cognitive behavioral therapy. First, he would anticipate the day's inevitable friction. He would mentally walk through the schedule, not with dread but with clear-eyed realism. He knew he would encounter the lazy official, the arrogant senator, the ungrateful subordinate, the tedious legal dispute. By naming these annoyances in advance, he stripped them of their power to surprise and provoke him. It is the difference between being blindsided by a wave and seeing it build on the horizon. You brace yourself, you plant your feet, you are ready. Second, he would remind himself of his core principles. He would repeat fundamental truths, what the Stoics called doctrines, to anchor his perception. Phrases like, "What is not good for the hive is not good for the bee," or "The obstacle is the way," or "You have power over your mind, not outside events." These were not inspirational quotes to be glanced at. They were commands to be internalized, the operating system he booted up each morning. Third, and most crucially, he would mentally rehearse his responses. He would visualize the annoying person and practice in his mind's eye, meeting them not with irritation but with patience, not with contempt but with a commitment to justice. He would see the frustrating event and rehearse seeing it as material for virtue. This rehearsal created neural pathways, making the virtuous response more automatic when the real moment arrived. He was programming his own reactions. Think of an athlete before a big game. They do not just show up, they visualize their plays. They feel the movements in their mind, so when the pressure is on, their body knows what to do. Marcus was an athlete of the mind, and the empire was his arena. This morning ritual was his warm-up. It transformed philosophy from a theory on a scroll into a lived, breath-by-breath reality. It ensured that when he stepped out of his private quarters, he was not a man being pulled by the chaos of the world, but a mind steering itself through it. The armor was on, and the day could begin, but even the strongest armor has its limits under constant siege. Yet as the sun set, another ritual began, one of quiet and honest accounting. If the morning was for preparation, the evening was for review. Before sleep, Marcus would turn his analytical gaze inward, not to punish himself, but to learn. This was his nightly audit, a systematic check on his own character. He would replay the day's interactions, the decisions made, the words spoken in haste or impatience. The goal was never self-flagellation, the crushing guilt we often associate with looking back. His aim was calm, surgical analysis. Where today did I act according to my nature, with justice, courage, and temperance, and where did I fall short, surrendering to irritation, vanity, or fear? He treated his own missteps not as moral failures, but as data points, like a general reviewing a battle to see where the lines held and where they buckled. For instance, after a frustrating meeting with a dishonest tax official, he might note that while he maintained outward composure, he allowed a simmering contempt to color his thoughts. That internal resentment was the lapse. The virtue he aimed for was to correct the man's error with justice, while understanding that the man's corruption stemmed from his own ignorance, a flaw to be addressed, not a personal insult to be hated. This practice served a profound psychological purpose. It prevented regrets from festering in the dark. By examining a shortcoming calmly at the end of the day, he drained it of its emotional poison. He could then make a simple resolution for tomorrow, a slight adjustment in his mental posture, rather than letting the memory become a source of lingering shame or a narrative about his own inadequacy. Think of it as daily maintenance for the soul. You would not ignore a small crack in the foundation of your house, pretending it isn't there, only to find the wall crumbling years later. You would inspect it, understand its cause, and make a plan to repair it. Marcus's evening review was that inspection. It transformed the inevitable stumbles of being human into the very curriculum for his growth. Each night he closed the books on the day, not with a score of success or failure, but with a clearer map for the journey ahead. This cycle of preparation and review created a powerful feedback loop, a system of continuous self-improvement that required no external critic, only his own unwavering commitment to the truth. And it was this relentless inner work that allowed him to face a final, universal challenge, one that shadows every life of purpose, the specter of being forgotten. There was a final tool in his mental arsenal, a kind of cognitive escape hatch for when the walls felt too close, when the weight of a single decision or a personal sorrow threatened to overwhelm him. Marcus Aurelius would perform a remarkable mental exercise. He called it viewing things from above, or sometimes taking the view from the hill. It was a deliberate shift in perspective, a way of breaking the suffocating cycle of rumination by zooming out, far out from the immediate moment. He would guide his mind to rise above the palace, above the city of Rome, above the Italian peninsula, until he could see the entire earth as a tiny blue-green sphere hanging in the vast blackness of space. From that impossible height, his empire, the source of all his anxiety and duty, shrank to a mere speck. The fierce Germanic tribes on the frontier became invisible. The bustling forums, the marching legions, the lines of petitioners, all dissolved into silence. He would then stretch his imagination across time, picturing the endless parade of generations before him and the countless ones to come. He would remind himself that everyone he had ever known, every famous conqueror, every bitter rival, every loved one lost, all now rested in the same earth. In this vast panorama, his own life, with all its struggles and triumphs, was a brief, flickering instant. This was not an exercise in nihilism or despair. It was the opposite. It was a tool for achieving profound peace by realizing the true scale of things. The argument that kept him up at night, the slight from a senator, the nagging pain of his own illness, when held against the backdrop of 1,000 years and 1 billion stars, simply lost its power to dominate his mind. He was recalibrating his emotional scale. What felt like a world-ending crisis from inside the palace became a manageable, passing event when seen from the cosmic hill. He writes to himself, "Keep before your eyes the whole vast sweep of time and the whole of reality. How puny your troubles seem in that context." This practice served a very specific psychological function. Depression and anxiety often trap us in a loop of repetitive, catastrophic thinking, where a single problem expands to fill our entire mental horizon. It is like holding a book so close to your face that you can see nothing but a blur of a single word. The view from above was the act of gently lowering the book, allowing the entire page, the chapter, the library to come back into view. The troubling word is still there, but it is now in its proper proportion, a small part of a much larger story. For Marcus, this was not about avoiding his duties. It was about performing them with a lighter heart and a clearer head. He could return from that mental vantage point to the gritty reality of governance, but he would carry back with him a quiet knowledge that none of this was the end of the world. The fate of the empire was his to shepherd, but the turning of the cosmos was not. This perspective drained the drama and panic from his daily life, leaving only the work itself, which he could then approach with a steady, untroubled focus. The weight did not disappear, but it became bearable because he had finally seen its true size. This cosmic view was intimately linked to his most powerful and misunderstood practice, the remembrance of death. For Marcus Aurelius, the awareness of mortality was not a morbid fixation, but a clarifying lens that brought every moment into sharp focus. He called it Memento Mori, a Latin phrase meaning remember you must die. In his private journal, he returns to this thought not with dread, but with a startling sense of urgency and gratitude. He writes, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." This was not a threat, it was an instruction manual. The certainty of an ending for him transformed time from an abstract concept into a precious, non-renewable resource. Imagine you are given a beautifully carved wooden box to hold your most important possessions. Knowing the box is finite, that it can only hold so much, you become incredibly selective. You would not fill it with pebbles and scraps of paper when there is room for a few pieces of gold. Marcus saw his life as that box. The awareness of its limit forced him to ask, is this thought, this argument, this worry worthy of the space? Is this pettiness, this resentment, this vanity a piece of gold or a worthless pebble? This practice systematically burned away trivialities. A rude comment from a rival, a bureaucratic delay, a personal slight, these were the pebbles. When held against the backdrop of a finite life, they lost all their weight and were discarded without a second thought. What remained was the gold, his duty, his virtue, his relationships, his work. This is the critical distinction between a depressive obsession with death and a stoic remembrance of it. Depression might whisper, nothing matters because it all ends. Memento Mori declares everything matters precisely because it all ends. One leads to paralysis, the other to purposeful action. Marcus used the thought as a daily alarm clock for the soul. He would remind himself that the person he was irritated with, the one wasting his time, would soon be gone, and so would he. This did not make life meaningless. It made every interaction sacred and fleeting, worthy of patience and kindness. He wrote, "Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what is left and live it properly." He was not fantasizing about an end. He was using the idea of an end to engineer a better middle. It pushed him out of bed on cold mornings. It helped him listen patiently to long-winded advisors. It fueled his commitment to justice even when it was inconvenient. The shadow of the end made the light of the present moment brighter and more urgent. His life was not a sentence to be served while waiting for death. It was a gift to be used with clear eyes and a full heart until the moment it was respectfully returned. This final step in his practice was the most radical, a complete inversion of how we are wired to think. Marcus Aurelius did not merely aim to accept his fate. He sought to love it, a concept the Stoics called Amor, Fati. This is not passive resignation, it is active, wholehearted endorsement of every single thread in the tapestry of life, especially the dark and knotted ones. For a man who wrote so openly of weariness and melancholy, this was the ultimate discipline, the summit of his mental training. He was striving to look at the very depression that shadowed him, at the plague ravaging his cities, at the betrayals and the endless wars, and say not just this is bearable, but this too is good because it is part of the whole. How can that possibly make sense? The key is in a subtle but profound shift in perspective. He trained himself to see his life not as a series of random events happening to him, but as a necessary and integral part of a vast, interconnected cosmos. In this view, every event, no matter how painful, is not a mistake or an interruption, but a vital piece of a pattern too large for any one person to fully comprehend. To resent a single piece is to resent the entire mosaic, to declare that you, from your limited vantage point, know better than the universe itself. His practice was to reframe each hardship not as an obstacle on his path, but as the path itself. The depression was not a wall keeping him from his duty. It was the very terrain across which his duty had to be walked. The difficult person was not a nuisance interrupting his peace. They were the precise individuals sent to give him an opportunity to practice patience. This is where gritty gratitude is born. It is not a bubbly, cheerful thankfulness for pain. It is a deep, sober appreciation for the raw material of character. He might say to himself, "This challenge, this sorrow, this internal weight is my assignment. It is the specific curriculum the world has given me to master resilience. Without it, I would be weaker, my wisdom untested, my compassion shallow. To love your fate, then, is to love your own opportunity to endure well." Imagine two sculptors. One is given a perfect, smooth block of pristine marble. The other is given a rough, flawed, jagged stone. The first sculptor might have an easier time, but the second, if they embrace the challenge, will create something far more interesting, unique, and strong, because their artistry is defined by working with the stone's inherent difficulties. Marcus chose to see himself as that second sculptor. His flawed material, his melancholy, and his tumultuous reign was not a curse, it was his specific medium. Amor Fati was the decision to love that medium, to see its constraints not as limitations, but as the very source of his potential masterpiece. This does not erase the pain, it transfigures its meaning. The emotional quality shifts from bitter resentment, "Why is this happening to me?" to a kind of determined reverence, "This is happening for me, to forge me." It turns suffering from a prison into a proving ground. For Marcus, this was the final liberation, a way to walk through the darkest valleys of life not as a victim, but as a participant in a grand, necessary, and ultimately beautiful design. His identity was not found in his moods but in his obligations. For Marcus Aurelius, the role of emperor was not a position of personal privilege to be enjoyed. It was a solemn office of service to be fulfilled. This sense of duty, a profound and unshakable commitment to the Commonwealth, became the most powerful counterweight to the inward gravity of his melancholy. When the internal voice whispered to withdraw, to hide from the unrelenting demands, his conception of self provided the answer. He was, by definition, a public servant. His personal feelings, however dark or heavy, were secondary data, a private weather system that could not be allowed to ground the ship of state. He writes in his meditations, "Do not be disgusted, do not give up in despair, if you do not succeed in acting on every right principle. Instead, when you are thrown off course, return again and rejoice if most of your actions are worthy of a good person." Notice the framing. The goal is not to feel good, but to act rightly. The measure of his day was not the lightness in his heart, but the weight of the responsibilities he carried forward. This external structure, this web of duties to the Senate, the army, and the citizens, provided a rigid framework that held him upright when his internal world felt formless and collapsing. It gave him a script to follow on the days he had forgotten his own lines. The needs of Rome were concrete and endless, a perpetual to-do list that brooked no existential hesitation. There was grain to be secured, courts to be held, frontiers to be defended. These were not abstract ideas, they were actions that required his physical presence, his attention, his signature. His depression might rob him of joy, but it could not, under his own philosophy, rob him of his ability to choose the next right action. In this way, duty functioned as a kind of behavioral compass. His feelings were the stormy seas, tossing the ship wildly, but duty was the fixed star by which he could still navigate. He repeatedly defines himself through this lens of service. In one powerful passage, he instructs himself, "At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, 'I am waking up to do the work of a human being. What do I have to complain about if I am going to do what I was born for?'" The work he references is not the work of an emperor per se, but the work of a rational, social creature, which for him was expressed through his imperial duties. This reframing is crucial. It universalizes the struggle. His specific task was to govern Rome, but the underlying principle applies to anyone: a parent caring for a family, a teacher preparing a lesson, a craftsman finishing a project. The work itself, the service to something larger than your own transient emotional state, becomes the anchor. Marcus took this further, seeing his service as a debt he was repaying. He viewed his life, his education, his position as gifts provided by the collective efforts of those who came before, by nature or by the gods. His duty was the payment on that debt. To shrink from that duty because of a private sadness was, in his view, a form of ingratitude and a violation of a cosmic contract. He writes, "You have endured infinite troubles through not being content with your inner guide, which is to do what the nature of a ruler demands." That inner guide was not his fleeting emotion, it was the rational understanding of his role. The needs of the Commonwealth were the ultimate authority, and his personal feelings were simply not relevant to the command. This might sound severe, even self-denying, but for Marcus it was a source of liberation. It freed him from the tyranny of his own interiority. On a difficult day, he did not have to answer the impossible question, "How do I fix how I feel?" He only had to answer the actionable question, "What does my station require of me right now?" The answer was always clear, and in following it, he often found that the feeling of purposelessness that accompanies depression would temporarily recede, displaced by the momentum of meaningful action. He served Rome not in spite of his depression, but through it, using the very structure of that service as the scaffold that kept him from being buried by it. The empire, in a very real sense, needed his melancholy to be met with his duty, for its stability depended on his unwavering commitment to the work, regardless of the weather within. His inner citadel was not built alone. While the Meditations present a profoundly solitary dialogue, Marcus Aurelius did not wage his private war in a vacuum. He was surrounded by a network of individuals, some teachers, some family, some comrades in arms, who formed the external scaffolding for his internal work. Stoicism, despite its focus on self-mastery, is deeply rooted in the concept of community. A core tenet is that we are rational and social creatures, born for cooperation, not isolation. Marcus understood that his duty was to the hive, and that meant engaging with the other bees, even when his instinct was to withdraw into his own cell. The first pillars of this support system were his teachers, particularly a stern Stoic philosopher named Junius Rusticus. It was Rusticus who handed the young Marcus a copy of the personal notes of the earlier Stoic teacher Epictetus, an event Marcus would later describe as transformative. This was not dry academic instruction, it was the passing of a toolkit. Rusticus represented the living link in a chain of wisdom, a mentor who provided not just knowledge but correction. Marcus writes of being grateful to Rusticus for showing him the need to correct his character and not be sidetracked into sophistry. Imagine a master carpenter overseeing an apprentice, not just praising good work, but immediately pointing out a flawed joint or a careless measurement. This was the support of rigorous, honest feedback, a voice outside his own head that held him to a higher standard. It was a relationship built on respect for wisdom, not on fleeting personal affection, and it gave him an external reference point for his own growth. Then there was the complex, shared burden of family and co-rule. His adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, was appointed as his co-emperor, a political necessity that created a partnership fraught with tension. Lucius was famously more inclined toward pleasure and luxury, a stark contrast to Marcus's disciplined austerity. This could have been a source of bitter resentment, a daily friction poisoning the well of his resolve. Yet Marcus's practice turned this potential obstacle into another field for virtue. He did not try to change Lucius's fundamental nature. Instead, he focused on his own duty within the partnership. He managed the administration and the harder military decisions, often shouldering the greater load, while ensuring Lucius received public honor. When Lucius died during a plague, Marcus mourned him deeply and honored his memory, focusing on the brother's better qualities. This imperfect, challenging relationship was a practical lesson in accepting what you cannot control in others while steadfastly upholding your own responsibilities. It was support in a paradoxical form, the friction that sharpened his patience and his commitment to the common good over personal grievance. Finally, there were the men on the front lines, his generals and provincial governors. He relied heavily on capable, loyal commanders to manage distant campaigns, men like Avidius Cassius. He trusted them with immense power and responsibility, knowing the stability of the frontiers depended on their skill and integrity. This delegation was an act of profound trust, a recognition that he could not personally hold every wall. His correspondence shows a leader deeply engaged with their concerns, treating them not as mere subordinates but as partners in the work of stewardship. He leaned on their expertise, their on-the-ground perspective, and their martial courage. In return, he offered them clear direction and public recognition. This mutual reliance was the Stoic concept of symbiosis in action, different parts of a single organism working in concert for the health of the whole. When one of these trusted men, Avidius Cassius, later rebelled against him, it was a devastating betrayal. Marcus's response, however, was telling. He expressed sorrow more than rage and famously sought to calm the Senate's anger, concerned more about sparing the empire a bloody civil war than about exacting personal vengeance. Even in betrayal, his philosophy and his support network framed his reaction. He fell back on his duty to the hive's peace, not his personal injury, so his solitude was a chosen practice, not a lived reality. He allowed himself to be supported by mentors who corrected him, by family who challenged him, and by soldiers who fought for him. He did not have to like them all, or agree with them, or even fully trust them. His task was to work with them for Rome. This web of relationships, imperfect and human, was the real-world arena where his private meditations were tested. It was one thing to write about patience in a journal by candlelight, and another to exercise it daily with a hedonistic co-emperor or a stubborn general. The people in his life provided the constant, gritty material for his philosophy. They were the anvil against which his inner steel was forged. His private battles were not confined to the mind. The same hand that penned lines on virtue also often pressed against a pained chest or a troubled stomach. Historical accounts and his own correspondence suggest Marcus Aurelius lived with persistent health challenges, likely chronic chest pain and digestive ailments. This physical suffering was a constant, unwelcome companion to his mental melancholy, a second front in his daily war for composure. Imagine carrying the fate of an empire on your shoulders while a dull, grinding ache sits in your ribs, a visceral reminder of your own fragility. For many, this combination would feel like a cruel trap, the mind and body conspiring to overwhelm. Yet Marcus had a philosophical framework for this, too, a way to prevent physical pain from becoming a mental catastrophe. The Stoics classified things like health, illness, pain, and pleasure as indifference. This is a term that often causes confusion. They did not mean these things were unimportant or that you should not seek medical care. They meant that these conditions were not inherently good or bad for your moral character, your true self. Your virtue, your reason, your integrity, these were the only true goods. Everything else, including the state of the body, was classified as preferred or dispreferred, but ultimately external to your core worth. A healthy body was a preferred indifferent, certainly easier and more pleasant to work with. A pained or ill body was a dispreferred indifferent, a more difficult condition. But neither one could make you a good or a bad person. Only your choices could do that. This distinction was his liberation. The pain in his chest was not a sign of failure or a punishment. It was simply a fact, like the weather outside. A storm is not evil, it is a meteorological event. His pain was a neurological event. His task was not to magically wish it away, which was impossible. but to prevent it from storming the citadel of his mind. He practiced what we might call compartmentalization, but of the most deliberate kind. He would acknowledge the sensation, I feel a sharpness here, a nausea there, and then he would consciously separate that sensation from his judgment of it. The body might signal distress, but the mind did not have to declare an emergency. He writes to himself, pain is neither intolerable nor unending, so long as you remember its limits and do not add to it in your imagination. That last part is the key, do not add to it in your imagination. The raw physical signal was one thing, the layer of mental panic, the why is this happening to me, the this will never end, the I cannot bear this, that was the added suffering, the second arrow. His discipline was to endure the first arrow without firing the second. There is a famous story, perhaps legendary but perfectly illustrative, of him during a difficult campaign. Suffering from his ailments, he was urged by his physicians to take a certain medicine, a potion that was known to be effective but also terribly bitter and unpleasant. He drank it down without the slightest change of expression. When his surprised companions remarked on his stoic face, he simply replied that enduring the bitterness was part of taking the medicine. He was not denying the taste existed. He was refusing to let his face, the outward signal of his inner state, be commanded by it. He applied this same principle to his daily duties. The pain was a background noise, sometimes loud, sometimes soft, but it did not cancel his appointments, halt his legal judgments, or delay his military dispatches. He moved through his obligations with the pain, not in spite of it, but by making a clear treaty with it. The body could have its complaints, but the mind had its work. This is perhaps the most physically demanding aspect of his philosophy, a rigorous training in the sovereignty of the will over mere sensation. He was not a masochist celebrating pain. He was a practitioner demonstrating that even the most intimate, demanding signals from our own flesh need not have the final vote on our character or our commitments. The body was the horse and the mind was the rider. A good rider feels every stumble and strain of the horse, but does not become the stumble. They feel the pain, acknowledge it, and keep guiding the animal forward on the path. Marcus Aurelius, in constant physical discomfort, remained the rider, his hand steady on the reins of an empire, proving that our deepest strength is not the absence of weakness, but the quiet decision of where we place our attention. The palace was a gilded cage, its bars forged from absolute power. Marcus Aurelius lived in the most magnificent prison imaginable, surrounded by marble and gold, yet isolated by the very authority he wielded. Supreme command creates a terrible solitude. Everyone who approaches you has a motive, a request, a hidden agenda. The laughter in the halls is measured, the compliments are currency, and the loyalty is often a bet placed on your continued favor. He could trust no one's smile completely, for it might mask ambition or fear. This is the profound paradox of the throne. You are never alone, yet you are perpetually lonely. The court was a theater of deception, a daily performance where he was both the lead actor and the only audience member forced to see behind the mask. Senators vied for influence, provincial governors exaggerated their successes, and foreign emissaries spun tales to secure advantage. For a man whose private writings reveal a deep craving for truth and genuine connection, this environment was a form of sustained psychic corrosion. How do you maintain your own authenticity when you are constantly reflected back as a symbol, an institution rather than a person? His journal hints at this weary awareness. He writes of the need to see through the costumes and the titles, to perceive the people beneath the robes, reminding himself that a senator is just a man, an emperor is just a man. This was a defense mechanism, a way to demystify the pageantry and reduce its power to alienate him. Within this cage, the possibility of simple, unguarded friendship was almost zero. Every relationship was asymmetrical, tainted by the immense gravity of his position. A companion could not forget he was speaking to the emperor, and Marcus could never fully forget he was being spoken to as the emperor. This lack of true peerage, of someone who could look him in the eye without calculation, must have deepened the melancholy he describes. His writings often express a quiet longing for the straightforward life of his philosophical predecessors, or even for the uncomplicated existence of a farmer. He speaks with respect of those who live close to the earth, free from the labyrinthine politics of the palace. This nostalgia for simplicity was not a wish to abandon his duty, but a yearning for the psychological clarity that his position constantly obscured. Stoicism became his key to this inner freedom. If he could not escape the golden cage physically, he would liberate his mind from within it. The philosophy taught him that while he could not control the flattery and deception swirling around him, he had absolute control over how he received it. He practiced seeing the court's theater for what it was, a natural consequence of power, not a personal betrayal. He chose to interpret the actions of others through a lens of understanding rather than cynicism. When faced with a flatterer, he could internally note, "This person acts according to their own nature, seeking advancement, and my role is to listen without being swayed by vanity." This mental distance disarmed the toxicity. He found authenticity not in changing the court, but in rigorously policing his own inner court. His private journal was the one place of complete honesty, where he could converse with himself without any filter or fear. There he cultivated the only friendship that was entirely safe and entirely real, the friendship with his own guiding principle. By focusing on his own virtue, his own judgments, and his own actions, he built a sanctuary of self that no courtier could enter and no deception could touch. The palace walls defined his world, but Stoicism defined his experience within those walls. He discovered that the most impregnable freedom is built not from stone, but from disciplined thought. The ultimate test of his inner citadel came not from the palace, but from the frozen banks of the Danube River. For over a decade, Marcus Aurelius would spend more nights in a military tent than in the imperial palace, leading what history calls the Marcomannic Wars. This was not a single glorious campaign, but a grinding, brutal stalemate against a coalition of Germanic tribes, a relentless pressure on the empire's northern frontier that threatened to rupture the entire border. It was here, in the mud and blood of a protracted struggle, that his philosophy moved from parchment to practice under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The external chaos was mirrored by profound personal loss. During these years, he faced the passing of several of his young children, and his co-emperor and brother, Lucius Verus, succumbed to illness. The weight of an empire at war was now compounded by the private, silent weight of grief. Yet the historical record shows a commander who did not retreat to Rome to mourn. He remained in the field winter after winter, personally overseeing fortifications, troop movements, and complex logistics. His strategic decisions during this period were marked by a stubborn, pragmatic resilience rather than flashy genius. He understood he was not fighting for a decisive, map-redrawing conquest, but for the survival of a frontier. His goal was not annihilation, but a sustainable peace, a goal he pursued through a mix of military pressure and eventual negotiation. Maintaining the morale of his legions, who were fighting a frustrating war of attrition far from home, became a daily exercise in applied stoicism. He shared their hardships, ate their simple food, and by his constant, uncomplaining presence, he became a living symbol of endurance. Coins minted during this time show him bearded and worn like a common soldier, not a detached god-king. This was a deliberate leadership choice. He was modeling the very virtue he expected from his men. And all the while, in the flickering light of those frontier outposts, he continued to write in his journal. The entries from this period are among his most powerful. He does not write of battle plans, but of the discipline required to face each day. He reminds himself to accept the chaos of war as his assigned material, to meet the treachery of enemy tribes without hatred, and to perform his duty despite the ache of personal loss. The war became the anvil, and his philosophy was the hammer constantly shaping his character. In one poignant reflection, written likely after news of a child's illness reached camp, he steers his thoughts not to despair but to a universal truth. He writes that what happens to everyone, the loss and the hardship, should not be seen as a strange or unbearable fate, but as part of the common lot of humanity, a shared condition to be borne with understanding. This was not cold detachment, it was a conscious broadening of perspective to prevent personal sorrow from collapsing his capacity to lead. He channeled the energy of grief into the meticulous work of command, transforming a potentially paralyzing emotion into fuel for focused action. The Marcomannic Wars stand as the most vivid proof that his inner work had a tangible, world-altering effect. His steady, principled leadership through a crisis that spanned years prevented a catastrophic breach of the empire's defenses. He demonstrated that the strength to hold a frontier line begins with the strength to hold a line within one's own mind, especially when that mind is filled with storms. The deepest wounds were not inflicted on the battlefield, but within the walls of his own home. Over the course of his life, Marcus Aurelius experienced a relentless series of personal losses that would have shattered a lesser spirit. He and his wife, the Empress Faustina, are believed to have had as many as 14 children, yet by the time of his own passing, only a handful survived, a stark testament to the fragility of life in the ancient world. The most devastating blow came with the death of Faustina herself, his partner for over 30 years, while they were together on a military campaign in the East. This was not a distant report, but an immediate, shattering reality. The man who commanded legions was now a husband standing alone. How does a philosophy of reason meet the raw, unreasoning pain of such grief? His private writings offer a profound answer. We find no cold dismissal of sorrow, no declaration that these losses were meaningless. Instead, we witness a meticulous, disciplined process of mourning, a way to feel the full depth of the wound without allowing it to become a fatal infection of the soul. In one passage, written likely in the shadow of a child's passing, he instructs himself, wipe away the impression, stop the puppet strings. It is catastrophic only if you judge it so. At first glance, this seems shockingly detached, but we must listen more carefully. He is not telling himself not to feel, he is initiating a process. The impression is the initial, overwhelming tsunami of pain. The puppet strings are the automatic reactions of panic and despair that jerk the mind into chaotic, catastrophic thinking. His first act is to create a moment of stillness between the event and his reaction, to wipe the slate of judgment clean just for an instant. This pause is not denial, it is the essential space in which choice becomes possible. He then guides his thoughts toward integration. He reflects on the nature of all living things, their temporary stay in a body, and their eventual return to the elements from which they came. He writes of how the universe is in constant change, and that to resist this change is to resist the very logic of nature itself. This is not a consolation that removes the sting of loss. It is a framework that contains it, that places a personal, agonizing event within the vast, neutral flow of cosmic process. The grief does not disappear, but it is no longer a solitary, alien monster in the dark. It becomes part of a universal human experience, a shared chapter in the story of all mortal things. He sought to transform the memory from a source of paralyzing pain into a source of clarified purpose. He would think not only of his own sorrow, but of the character of the one he lost. In Faustina's case, despite the rumors and criticisms leveled at her by later historians, his own actions speak volumes. He deeply mourned her, had her deified by the Senate, and founded a school for orphan girls in her name. He focused on her virtues, her role as a mother and empress, and honored that legacy through continued action. This is the disciplined heart of his approach. He allowed himself to feel the desolation, but he would not let that feeling veto his duty to the living or his respect for the departed. The work of an empire, the care for his remaining son, these obligations continued. He moved through them not as a man untouched by grief, but as a man carrying it with him, integrating its weight into his every step. His mourning was a quiet, persistent practice of returning his attention from the abyss of absence to the demands of the present moment. He teaches us that resilience is not the absence of tears, but the strength to see them dry and then look back at the world, to find a reason within the ruins to build again. The greatest contradiction of his reign lay not in his own heart, but in the future he chose for Rome. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king who dedicated his life to duty and reason, made a single decision that history has judged with brutal clarity: the appointment of his only surviving son, Commodus, as his sole successor. This was not a philosophical miscalculation, but a human one, a collision between the cold logic of statecraft and the warm, stubborn pull of a father's hope. It reveals the ultimate limit of his famed control, a frontier even he could not secure. The Stoic ideal demanded that the best person rule, regardless of bloodline. For centuries, the empire had operated on a system of adoptive succession, where an emperor would select the most capable man, not necessarily his own son, to ensure stable and competent leadership. Marcus himself was a product of this brilliant system, chosen for his character, not his lineage. His own writings are silent on the specific choice of Commodus, but his actions speak volumes. He broke with a century of tradition. He appointed the teenage Commodus as co-emperor years before his own passing, bringing him on military campaigns, immersing him in the rituals of power. Why would the most stoic of emperors seemingly abandon a core principle of his philosophy for the sake of familial succession? We must look beyond simple failure of judgment. One powerful force was the sheer weight of biological continuity. After enduring the loss of so many children, Commodus was not just a political heir, he was a living testament to survival, the sole remaining son in a world where dynasty carried profound cultural and almost mystical weight. The natural human desire to see one's own blood continue a legacy is a force that can bend even the most disciplined logic. Furthermore, Marcus may have believed in the power of education and mentorship. He had been meticulously trained by the best minds of his era, and he likely hoped that by immersing Commodus in the same rigorous environment of duty and philosophy, he could shape him into a worthy ruler. He surrounded the young man with trusted advisors, modeling the very stoic virtues he hoped would take root. This was a father's gamble, betting that nurture could triumph over nature. The political reality was also a factor. By the time Commodus came of age, the old system of adoptive succession may have already felt unstable. Powerful military factions and court interests often rallied around a clear dynastic claimant to prevent civil war upon an emperor's passing. Appointing his own son could have been seen, paradoxically, as the choice most likely to ensure a smooth and immediate transition, to preserve the peace of the hive in the short term, even if it risked the long-term health of the hive itself. Here we see the tragic tension in its rawest form. His duty to Rome demanded the best possible ruler. His duty as a father and his very human affection pulled him toward his son. In the end, the natural bond proved stronger than the philosophical ideal. This was not a failure of his stoic practice in dealing with his own emotions, but a failure of its application to the external world of political selection. He could control his judgment of events, but he could not control the inherent character of another person, not even his own child. He could model virtue, but he could not implant it. The aftermath is written in history's grim ledger. Commodus, upon assuming full power, rejected his father's teachings, indulging in spectacle, paranoia, and a style of rule that unraveled much of the stability Marcus had fought so hard to preserve. The Son saw the throne not as a duty, but as a divine right to personal pleasure. This outcome forces a sobering reflection on the boundaries of philosophy. A system for mastering the self does not guarantee the mastery of fate, especially when fate is entrusted to the will of another. Marcus Aurelius built an inner citadel that withstood plague, war, and profound personal sorrow, yet its walls could not protect the empire from the heir he loved. His life teaches that our control has a final, immutable frontier, the free will and character of those we hope to guide. We can only ever be responsible for the integrity of our own choices, never for the outcomes they set in motion through others. This is perhaps his most human lesson, a reminder that wisdom is not about perfect foresight, but about the dignity with which we bear the consequences of our hopes, even when they break against the rocks of reality. The journal itself is a kind of battlefield artifact, dug up not from soil but from the depths of a mind under siege. To read the Meditations is to encounter something startlingly intimate, a text that defies every expectation of a royal philosophy. There are no polished arguments, no structured chapters designed to persuade an audience. Instead, we find a cascade of reminders, a series of memoranda written in the second person, commands hurled at the self. You can almost see the hurried strokes of the pen, the candle guttering low in a military tent. He writes the same ideas, the same core principles, over and over again. Do not waste time on gossip. See through the masks people wear. Accept what you cannot change. This repetition is not a literary flaw, it is the entire point. This was not a book he was writing, it was a mind he was building, brick by mental brick, in real time. The raw, unpolished, and cyclical nature of the text is the strongest evidence we have that these were not abstract musings, but emergency protocols. Think of a pilot's pre-flight checklist. They do not read it once and assume they will remember every step. They go through it every single time before every single flight, because the stakes are too high to rely on memory or mood. Marcus Aurelius was that pilot, and his empire was the aircraft. His journal was the checklist he ran through each morning and evening to ensure his mental instruments were calibrated, to prevent a catastrophic error in judgment. The phrases he returns to are his vital gauges: altitude, fuel, direction. When he feels the fog of melancholy descending, he reads the line about the view from the hill. When irritation at a subordinate flares, he repeats the passage about people acting from ignorance. He is not exploring new philosophical territory. He is drilling on the fundamentals, because in a storm you do not have the luxury for innovation. You fall back on trained reflex. The text's very lack of polish is what makes it so powerfully authentic. It is a direct recording of the struggle, a live transcript of a man reasoning himself back from the edge, day after day. He is not presenting a solution, he is caught in the act of applying one. This transforms the Meditations from a distant philosophical treatise into something far more urgent, a manual for survival written in the trenches of lived experience. Its value lies not in its originality, but in its relentless practicality, a worn tool kept close at hand, its pages smudged from constant use. This 2,000-year-old journal reads like a modern therapeutic workbook. Placing Marcus Aurelius's private struggles beside our contemporary understanding of mental well-being reveals a startling resonance, not a perfect match, but a profound parallel that speaks to a shared human architecture of thought. Today, we recognize depression as a complex health condition with biological, psychological, and social dimensions, often requiring professional support and, when appropriate, medical treatment. Stoicism, as Marcus practiced it, was not that treatment, nor is it a substitute for the compassionate, evidence-based care available now. Yet, the core mechanics of his daily practice bear a striking resemblance to the foundations of a widely used modern therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. The central insight of CBT is that our emotions and behaviors are not directly caused by events, but but by our beliefs and interpretations of those events. A person feeling a deep sadness might have an automatic thought like "I am a failure," which then fuels the emotional pain and leads to withdrawal. The therapy involves identifying those automatic, often distorted thoughts, examining the evidence for and against them, and then developing more balanced, realistic ways of thinking. Listen to Marcus in his tent, writing, "You have the power to strip away many unnecessary troubles that are wholly in your imagination." He is doing precisely that, catching the automatic judgment, the catastrophic story his mind is spinning, and challenging its validity. When he feels disgust at the repetitive needs of the body, he does not accept that disgust as the final truth. He pauses and reframes it, noting this is simply the nature of a physical being, not a condemnation of existence itself. This is cognitive restructuring in its most raw, self-administered form. His morning ritual of anticipating the day's annoyances is a form of what therapists call cognitive rehearsal, preparing his mind to respond with patience instead of irritation. His evening review is a structured behavioral audit, assessing where his actions aligned with his values. He was, in essence, his own therapist, using written prompts to dispute the irrational narratives his low moods generated. The parallel is not coincidental. The founders of CBT explicitly drew inspiration from Stoic philosophy, recognizing in these ancient texts a pragmatic system for managing destructive thought patterns. What Marcus called impressions, we might call cognitive distortions, all or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, emotional reasoning. His discipline was to insert that crucial pause between the impression and his assent to say, is this thought true, or is it merely a feeling wearing the costume of a fact? This does not mean he cured his melancholy through sheer willpower, a dangerous and inaccurate conclusion. It means he developed a robust set of mental skills to prevent that melancholy from defining his life and paralyzing his duty. He built a cognitive immune system. The modern therapeutic alliance adds a crucial element Marcus lacked, a compassionate guide, a supportive relationship to help navigate this difficult inner work. He had to be both patient and therapist, a tremendously heavy lift. This contrast illuminates the gift of our current understanding. We do not have to do this work alone. Yet it also highlights the timeless utility of the core practice, the radical idea that we can question our own thoughts, that we are not prisoners of our initial interpretations. Marcus Aurelius's legacy, in this light, is not just as a Roman emperor, but as an early, relentless pioneer of cognitive self-management, proving that even in the deepest fog, we can learn to navigate by questioning the maps our minds automatically draw. This is where his example can be dangerously misunderstood. A casual glance at his life might suggest that Stoicism is about building a wall against feeling, about achieving a state of robotic indifference to pain or joy. That interpretation misses the entire point, and worse, it can turn a philosophy of resilience into a manual for emotional suppression. Marcus Aurelius was not trying to feel nothing. He was fighting to not be destroyed by everything he felt. The distinction is subtle, but it is everything. His target was not emotion itself, which he understood as a natural human response. His target was what the Stoics called the passions, the destructive, runaway versions of those emotions that hijack reason. Think of the difference between feeling a wave of sadness and being pulled under by a riptide of despair. Or between feeling a flash of anger and being consumed by a blind rage. The feeling is the wave, the passion is the riptide. His practice was not to stop the ocean from having waves, but to learn how to swim so he wouldn't drown in them. He sought to experience the feeling without adding the catastrophic story, the second arrow of judgment that amplifies pain into suffering. This is why his journal is filled with feeling. He writes of weariness, of disgust, of the temptation to hide. He acknowledges these states with clear-eyed honesty. The work begins in what he does next. He does not wallow in them or let them dictate his actions. He examines them, questions their narrative, and then channels that raw emotional energy into a constructive direction. The energy from his melancholy did not vanish. It was redirected into the meticulous work of governance. The frustration with a difficult person became fuel for practicing patience, a conscious, active virtue. This is not suppression, it is alchemy, the transformation of base emotional metal into the gold of purposeful action. A modern misreading that promotes toxic positivity or emotional numbness would have been foreign to him. He never commanded himself to be happy. He commanded himself to be useful, to be just, to be courageous, regardless of whether he felt happy or sad in that moment. The goal was inner freedom, not inner emptiness. To mistake his discipline for detachment is to confuse a sailor who reads the storm with one who pretends the storm isn't there. One navigates through the tempest, the other is sunk by it. Marcus Aurelius spent his life learning to navigate, feeling every drop of rain and every roll of the deck, but keeping his hand steady on the tiller of his duty. His struggle was not a flaw in his character, but the raw material for its construction. At the heart of Marcus Aurelius's endurance was a profound act of meaning-making. He did not merely withstand suffering, he systematically interpreted it, using the framework of Stoicism to weave a coherent and purposeful narrative from the threads of chaos and pain. When a random misfortune struck or a wave of melancholy rose, his mind did not default to seeing it as a meaningless tragedy. Instead, he engaged in a deliberate cognitive process, asking, "What can virtue do with this?" This question transformed every hardship from a disruptive event into a specific lesson, a targeted exercise for his moral and mental muscles. The plague was not a senseless horror, it was material for practicing courage and compassion in leadership. A betrayal was not just a personal wound, it was an opportunity to practice justice without vengeance. His own persistent low mood was not a sign of failure, it was the very resistance against which he could strengthen his discipline. By reframing each challenge as a necessary part of his curriculum, he removed the sting of randomness. Nothing was arbitrary anymore, everything served his development. This is the core mechanism of his resilience, the transformation of passive endurance into active, purposeful training. A modern psychologist might call this benefit finding, the ability to identify positive lessons or growth in the face of adversity. For Marcus, it was a daily philosophical practice. He constructed a story in which he was not a victim of fate, but a student in the school of life, and every difficult person or painful event was a teacher, however harsh. This narrative gave him agency. He could not control the event, but he could absolutely control what it meant, and therefore what it was for. A block of marble is just a rock until a sculptor sees the potential statue within. Marcus looked at the rough, jagged stones of his life and saw within each one the possibility for a specific virtue to be carved out. The meaning was not discovered, it was assigned, and that act of assignment was the source of his power. It allowed him to move through the world not with the brittle hope that bad things would not happen, but with the unshakable confidence that he could use whatever happened. This is how suffering, when woven into a narrative of purpose, loses its capacity to destroy. It becomes instead the loom on which a stronger self is woven. His reign marked the final chapter of a golden age. Marcus Aurelius is remembered as the last of the 5 good emperors, the ruler whose passing closed the long era of relative peace and prosperity known as the Pax Romana. This historical label carries a profound weight, a quiet acknowledgement that his time was the sunset of a certain kind of stability. His 19-year rule was not one of glorious expansion or monumental building projects that defined earlier emperors. Instead, it was a period of relentless defense, a holding action against pressures that would eventually reshape the ancient world. He inherited an empire at its peak of territorial size, and he spent his life preventing its fracture. In that sense, his greatest political achievement was not conquest but preservation. He held the line both on the Danube frontier and within the complex machinery of the state, through sheer diligence and an unwavering sense of duty. Future generations would look back on his era not as a beginning, but as a dignified and principled end, a final demonstration of how Rome could govern itself with reason before a different, more turbulent age began. This historical positioning, however, is only half of his legacy. The other half is far more personal and has proven far more enduring. The marble statues and triumphal arches of his successors have largely crumbled, but the private journal he never meant to publish has survived for 2,000 years. That is where his true impact lies, not in the borders he held, but in the inner territory he mapped for all of us who would come after. He left behind a blueprint, not for ruling an empire, but for ruling a self. His legacy is the powerful example that leadership and introspection are not opposing forces. For centuries, the model of a strong leader was often one of outward command, of decisive action untroubled by doubt or deep reflection. Marcus Aurelius presented a radical countermodel, that of the leader who draws his strength from a continuous, honest conversation with his own weaknesses. He proved that the fortitude to command legions could be forged in the quiet, daily struggle to command one's own thoughts. In him, we see that self-mastery is not a retreat from the world, but the very foundation for engaging with it effectively. A leader who understands his own mind, who has practiced navigating its storms, is less likely to be thrown into panic by external chaos. He demonstrated that the calm at the center of a hurricane is not the absence of wind, but a different kind of strength, one built from knowing how to stand within it. This fusion of the philosophical and the practical is his gift to history. We remember him not because he was perfect, but because he was persistently human under impossible pressure. He did not offer a cure for depression or a secret to eternal happiness. He offered something perhaps more valuable, a method for finding purpose and performing your duty even on the days when happiness feels out of reach. His life argues that our deepest power is not the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to meet it with a disciplined mind. He turned his own internal battlefield into a classroom, and his notes from that class, scribbled by candlelight, continue to teach us that the most important empire we will ever be tasked with governing is the one between our own ears. The inner citadel is not a metaphor for the absence of feeling, but for the sovereignty of choice. Marcus Aurelius proved that a person could host a storm of melancholy within their own mind, and yet still stand firm at the center of it, because he had spent a lifetime constructing walls not of stone but of perception. This is the universal principle his life offers, a principle far more accessible than ruling an empire. Your mind can be a fortress, but only if you are its architect and its steadfast guard. The building materials are not grand philosophies learned in a single lecture. They are the small, daily practices of how you interpret the world. Every time you catch a reactive thought and question it, you are laying a brick. Every time you choose a purposeful action despite a low mood, you are raising a wall. Every time you accept an outcome you cannot change without resentment, you are reinforcing the gate. This citadel does not make you invulnerable to life's arrows. The pain, the loss, the frustration still land. What it does is change their destination. They strike the outer walls of your practiced discipline. They do not penetrate the central courtyard of your core self, your values, and your will. Marcus's entire journal was the meticulous blueprint for this construction project. He was not waiting to feel better to start building. He was building precisely because he did not feel better. The internal weather of depression was the very climate in which he had to learn to build. proving the fortress is most necessary when the skies are darkest. Think of it as learning to sail. You do not wait for a calm sea to practice. You practice in the very waves that threaten to capsize you, because that is where the skill becomes real. His disciplined practice of perception, action, and will were the three master craftsmen working on his inner stronghold. Perception decided what building materials an event would provide. Action was the labor of shaping them, and will was the acceptance of the final, immutable landscape upon which the citadel stood. This transforms our understanding of strength. We often believe strength is the absence of weakness, the lack of cracks in the facade. His life argues that true strength is the integrity of the structure behind the facade, a structure that can have cracks, can feel the cold wind, and yet still provide shelter and a vantage point. You do not need to be emperor to face this architectural task. Anyone who has ever gotten out of bed on a hard morning, anyone who has been kind when they felt irritable, anyone who has focused on a task while carrying a private worry, has laid a brick in their own inner citadel. The goal is not to never feel besieged. The goal is to know with quiet certainty that you have built a place within yourself where the siege cannot reach what matters most. Your character, your purpose, and your peace do not belong to the chaos outside. They are guarded within by the daily choices you make about where to place your attention and your effort. This is the ultimate freedom Marcus Aurelius earned, not from his golden palace, but from the disciplined workshop of his own mind. This blueprint is not locked in the past. The practices Marcus Aurelius used to steady an empire can be adapted to steady a single life, your life, in the modern world. We are not aiming for imperial grandeur, but for personal governance, for the quiet authority to direct our own days with more clarity and less internal chaos. The goal is to translate his ancient disciplines into simple, repeatable actions that fit between checking your phone and starting your commute. Let us begin with the morning, that vulnerable space between sleep and the day's demands. Marcus did not scroll through messages, he prepared his mind. Your version need not be an hour of meditation. It can be 5 minutes with a notebook, or even just a moment of intentional thought before your feet hit the floor. The core is the same: anticipate friction. Silently name the likely challenges ahead, the difficult conversation, the tedious task, the person who tests your patience. By naming them, you disarm their power to surprise you. Then, set a single intention, a guiding principle for the day. It could be as simple as today, I will listen fully, or I will focus on what I can control. This is not positive affirmation, it is cognitive priming, installing your chosen software before the world starts inputting its chaos. You are the emperor of your coming day, holding a brief council with yourself before opening the gates. The view from above, his cosmic perspective, is perhaps the most powerful tool for breaking the spell of modern anxiety. You do not need to visualize the whole cosmos. The practice is about shifting your mental camera from a close-up to a wide-angle lens. When a problem feels all-consuming, when a worry is looping in your mind, pause. Physically step away if you can. Look out a window, see the sky, the clouds moving, the trees that were there before you and will be after. Think about the scale of your city, the millions of other lives with their own private struggles and joys unfolding simultaneously. Consider your own life on a timeline, remembering a worry from 5 years ago that now holds no power. This mental zoom out does not make your problem disappear, it recalibrates its true size. It reminds you that this moment, however intense, is a single scene in a very long film. The feeling that everything is collapsing is almost always an illusion of proximity. By practicing this shift, you create space between you and the emotion, space where you can choose a response instead of being hijacked by a reaction. It is the ultimate antidote to catastrophizing. His nightly review was an audit of character, not productivity. Our modern equivalent is not scrolling through the day's failures on social media. It is a brief, non-judgmental inventory. In the last quiet minutes before sleep, ask yourself 2 questions in a spirit of curiosity, not criticism. Where today did I act in alignment with my values? Perhaps you were patient with a customer or you finished a project with care. Acknowledge that, then ask, where did I fall short? Perhaps you snapped at a loved one or avoided a necessary task. Do not dwell in guilt. Simply note it as data, as Marcus did, like a scout reporting on the day's terrain. The final, crucial step is to make one small resolution for tomorrow based on that data. If you were impatient, your resolution might be, tomorrow, I will take one deep breath before responding to frustration. This practice, done consistently, builds self-awareness without self-flagellation. It closes the mental ledger on the day, allowing you to rest without unresolved regrets haunting the dark. It turns daily stumbles into a curriculum for gradual, genuine growth. These practices form a sustainable system for inner management. The morning preparation sets your course. The view from above keeps you oriented when storms blow you off track. The nightly review helps you correct your navigation for the next leg of the journey. Together, they build that inner citadel not from grand, one-time efforts, but from the steady accumulation of small, conscious choices. You are not fighting to eliminate low moods or stress. You are building a structure that can house them without collapse. The strength of Marcus Aurelius was not in being untouched by darkness, but in having a practiced routine for lighting a candle within it. Your version of that routine, tailored to your life, can grant you the same sovereign peace, the ability to meet whatever the day holds from a place of chosen calm, rather than reactive panic. This is the true translation of his power, from the throne of Rome to the chair at your desk, from the imperial scepter to the simple, steady resolve to govern your own mind. The most powerful man in the world found his strength in a place we are taught to hide. Marcus Aurelius did not lead from a pedestal of perfect confidence, but from the trenches of his own acknowledged fragility. This resolves the central paradox of his life. His authority as emperor was not diminished by his melancholy, it was forged by it. Real power, he demonstrated, does not come from an illusion of invincibility, but from an unflinching familiarity with your own limits. Think of 2 leaders, one presents a flawless facade, a marble statue that never cracks. The other is transparent about their struggles, showing the careful repairs that hold them together. Which one do you trust more in a crisis? The statue may inspire awe, but it is brittle. The repaired vessel, having known the pressure, inspires confidence because it has been tested and holds. Marcus was the repaired vessel. His daily confrontation with weariness, his constant awareness of his own mortality, this was not a secret flaw. It was the source code for a more authentic, and therefore more durable, form of leadership. He ruled not as a god-king, but as a fellow human who understood hardship intimately. This self-knowledge prevented the arrogance and isolation that corrupt so much power. Because he knew he was susceptible to low moods, he could spot despair in others and meet it with compassion, not contempt. Because he accepted that he would one day be gone, he focused on building systems and making just decisions that would outlast him, rather than on monuments to his own glory. His authority was rooted in reality, not in performance. A leader who believes their own myth of invincibility is dangerous. They take reckless risks, ignore wise counsel, and see dissent as a personal threat. A leader who knows their own weakness governs with caution, seeks advice, and listens to criticism because they understand that their personal perspective is limited and fallible. Marcus' journal was a lifelong audit of those limitations. By staring directly at his own potential for failure, for collapse, for error, he inoculated himself against their worst effects. He built his decisions on the solid ground of what is, not the shifting sand of what he wished were true. This is why his reign, for all its external crises, is remembered for its steadfast integrity. The strength was in the acknowledgement. He did not conquer his depression, he made a treaty with it. and that treaty gave him a clearer view of the human condition he was tasked with governing. His rule was strong because it was real, anchored in the sober truth of a mind that had mapped its own darkest valleys and still chose every morning to walk the path of duty. His private notebook is a map of a mind that refused to be conquered by its own terrain. We have walked through the inner world of a man who commanded the greatest empire on earth while waging a quiet, relentless campaign within. His story dismantles a persistent myth, the idea that personal turmoil disqualifies you from public duty or that true strength requires an unshakable mood. Marcus Aurelius proved the opposite, that a disciplined framework for understanding your own thoughts can transform private challenges into the very fuel for steadfast service. He did not eliminate his melancholy, he learned to govern alongside it, using the tools of perception, action, and will to build an inner citadel from which he could rule an outer one. The profound takeaway is not about historical admiration, but about practical possibility. Your deepest struggles are not necessarily obstacles to your purpose. They can be the raw material for it, if you have a system for working with them. His life is a testament to the power of a practiced mind, a mind that treats every feeling as information and every hardship as a specific kind of training. The chaos of the world and the chaos within become manageable not when they stop, but when you develop a reliable method for navigating them. This is the enduring gift of his accidental journal. It was never meant for us, yet it speaks directly to anyone who has ever felt the weight of responsibility pressing against a weary spirit. In our own turbulent times, his words offer something more valuable than ancient wisdom. They offer a working model. They show that steadiness is not a personality trait you are born with, but a skill you build brick by mental brick through daily repetition. The true monument to Marcus Aurelius is not a crumbling statue in Rome, but the living example of a human being who looked directly at his own fragility and chose to build a life of immense strength upon it. His private pages invite you to begin your own construction, to see your mind not as a foe to be silenced, but as a territory to be understood and skillfully governed. If this journey into his inner world has resonated with you, the path does not end here. The entire school of Stoic philosophy, from Epictetus to Seneca, awaits as a deeper well of these practical tools for living. Their collective insight forms a timeless guide for finding clarity, resilience, and purpose, not by escaping the human condition, but by engaging with it one deliberate thought at a time.